Well, thanks, Josh, for that kind introduction, and thank you so much for coming out tonight. And it is great to come down to Trinity Christian, where I have visited once before, but a long time before this building was built. And it's great to be here. And John Baker, who I've known as a professional colleague for more than 20 years, it's great to come down and see that he does make an honest living somewhere in the community. And it's great to come down here and have a chance to speak to some of you earlier today and see what's going on here at Trinity Christian. It's an important place for me to know about, and I'm glad to have had the opportunity to say hello to some of you and look forward to hearing from you somewhere down the road. And I'm happy to talk about this topic today, the topic about Chicago art. What does Chicago mean in the sort of pantheon of contemporaneity? What's our place at the table of contemporary culture? Because it's important for us. Some of you are, as the way I always put it, some of you are born Chicagoans, some of you are temporary Chicagoans, some of you may end up staying here, as I did. I came to go to school in Chicago, and I'm still here many, many decades later. And what does it mean to be an artist or a critic or a cultural person who cares about culture and live in the Chicagoland area? Because if you look at that map of, or the image of North America there, I sometimes think you couldn't throw darts at that image and find two more physically marginalized places to build our major cultural capitals than we have in our society. Two places literally at the fringes of America. I'm speaking, of course, of New York and Los Angeles. Really at the almost the complete edges of the United States. And it's one of the curiosities of American culture that those are the two capitals of our culture, of our, they decide what TV films or what TV programs are made, what movies are made, what goes in the national news, what fashion, so many things are determined in New York and Los Angeles. I always think the great irony about Chicago is that Chicago has come in third in a contest in which there is only first and second place. It's good that we came in third, that we live in the third most important art center in the country. That is good. That's important. But it really doesn't matter in terms of our access to the American mind that we come in third. We could be Dallas or Miami or Seattle. It doesn't really matter who comes in third, because first and second eats about 90% of the pie. They're the ones who really dictate what will pass for contemporary culture. Sometimes I make the argument, let's say we're not a room full of young artists or not so young artists, people who are arts professionals. Let's say we were a room full of theater people. This is a building that shares space with the theater department. Let's say you were, instead of young artists, you were young actors or young directors or young screenwriters or young fiber artists. We're working for film, I guess, not fiber artists, fashion, costume designers, etc. I might say to that young man or woman, yes, this is a great place to go to school. You can go to school here or go to school at the University of Illinois or Northwestern or DePaul or something like that. But if you want to go where the best people in your craft are working, if you want to go where the opportunity to test your skills are, if you want to go where, and I don't think it's a bad thing, where money and fame might reside, I might say to that young actor or actress or director that you've got to go to New York or LA. You can't get it done from Chicago. You can't have a major national career as an actor if you can be from Chicago, but if you stay in Chicago, it can't be done. So that intrigues me. The question is, well, what if you're a young painter? What if you're a young fiber artist? What if you're a young printmaker? Do you have similar kind of prohibitions? Do you have similar kind of caps on what you can get accomplished as an American artist today? Well, I don't know. The answer is I'm not sure. I think we do pay a little price because we have chosen to live and work in the Midwest. I'm going to argue that the Midwest is actually a separate artistic zone in the United States, but I don't think we should blind ourselves to the fact that, to people who live in New York and LA, there's something, and are involved in the art world, there's something oddly wrong with us. We haven't done what they've done. We haven't moved to the major art capitals of our time. We've chosen to stay and fight it out somewhere else, and they look at us with vague suspicion and some disdain, as I'm going to argue. I'm showing you here, of course, an image of North America, and then there's a painting that somewhat speaks of our position called The Hinterlands, painted on the banner by a young artist named, well, not so young anymore, by an artist named David Lefkowitz in 1998, because I think he is acknowledging what sometimes we do, we call ourselves out sometimes as a culture in the Midwest. We acknowledge, well, we're not as hip as, if we lived in New York or LA, maybe we'd be a little more hip or a little more tuned into what's going on in high culture. Maybe we do live in the hinterlands. Maybe we've self-exiled that. Sometimes there's a little of that, I think, in Midwestern thinking. I think he's doing this tongue-in-cheek. I don't think he really believes he lives in the hinterlands, but I think he is acknowledging vague little bits of inferiority that sometimes people do feel who live and work here. On your left here is a photograph of Ed Paschke, who before his death in 2004 was the most famous Chicago artist, the most famous artist of our community. Born here, raised here, went to school here, taught here, lived here, died here. He now has a show at the Gagosian Gallery in New York that's getting a lot of attention. Etc. An important fellow, very, very nice man, a good friend to me and to some people here, undoubtedly. And I'm trying to find the first page of his obituary. Here it is. But when he died in 2004, he got an obituary in the New York Times. I remember a lot of my friends and his friends were pleased that he got an obituary in the New York Times. It was almost worth dying, I think. So you get an obituary in the New York Times, you really feel you've really accomplished something. Of course, you're not there to enjoy it, but there it is. Roberta Smith, who's an important art critic of the New York Times, said this about Ed Paschke. She said, along with Jim Nutt, Peter Saul, and to some extent Ed Ruscha, Mr. Paschke was an artist whose contribution to the art of his time was somewhat obscured by his distance from New York, end quote. Now that's, I think, a very, very telling statement. This is the chief critic of the New York Times saying, again, along with Jim Nutt, Peter Saul, and to some extent Ed Ruscha, that's another Chicagoan, a Californian, and a Texan. Mr. Paschke was an artist whose contribution to the art of his time was somewhat obscured by his distance from New York. That's what they think of us in New York. They think that if we don't live in New York, our contribution to the art of our time is somewhat obscured. He did not have the ability to make a major contribution to the art of his time because he didn't live in New York. That's what Roberta Smith is saying. Now, I don't agree with that, but I understand where she's coming from. And that's somewhat tongue-in-cheek. Here's a very meant to be a funny cartoon by Saul Steinberg from the New Yorker from the late 70s, where he's showing how a New Yorker sees America. New Yorker's on 8th Avenue and of course sees 9th Avenue and 10th Avenue and every apartment building and every car and every pedestrian. And then there's the Hudson River, but to a New Yorker, the rest of the country is just some sort of amorphic glob. They have no idea where anything is. I suppose we should be glad that we get mentioned here, Imagine that you're from, Detroit or something. I mean, you're not even on the map. But really, to a New Yorker, the rest of the country doesn't matter. It's just some sort of big amorphic glob. It's a place to be from, the rest of the country. I mean, I speak to editors in New York practically every day, now by email mostly, but the first time I'm in a conversation with a new editor in New York, the second sentence out of their mouth is, oh, I'm from Sheboygan, or oh, I'm from Louisville, or oh, I'm from, Omaha. They're all from the Midwest or somewhere else, but they think they've done the right thing. They've moved to New York, and they, as I think Roberta Smith is indicating, hold in vague suspicion people like us, and some of you may be moving elsewhere, but people like me, people like John perhaps, who have decided not to move to New York, have decided to stay here for various and sundry reasons. Now I'm going to argue that something else is going on, that it isn't really a question so much of geography as it is of indigenous style, but we'll get to that. And so I'm going to have to go back into history somewhat to make this argument. To talk about some early 20th century artists that set up this idea of the Midwest as a separate art region, distinct from the art produced elsewhere. Now here's two paintings by a guy named Thomas Hart Benton, who was educated at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and a very famous Midwestern artist. Now the history of art is filled, I know you take some art history here, the history of art is filled. In fact, it's the standard story of the history of modern art, that you start out like the artist, like the image on the right, and you end up like the image on the left. That is the canonical story of the history of art. You start out conservative, representational, realist, something like that. And then you end up abstract and avant-garde and isolated and all that sort of thing. And it is a story that is told because, generally speaking, it's a somewhat accurate story if you look at the development of many of the famous artists of modern art. Among the things that make Thomas Hart Benton is that interesting is that he goes the other way around. He did the painting on the left before he did the painting on the right. He will reject his sort of modern experimental avant-garde quality. Just to put in context, that's called Bubbles on the Left from 1914. When he painted that in 1914, there weren't a dozen people on the planet who had any idea what he was doing, about color simultaneity and orphism and, really avant-garde thinking about color and paint application and movement in a work of art. The painting on the right, called The Lord is My Shepherd, is from 1926, done 12 years later, and done in New York. Actually, that painting on the right was done in New York City. And it represents everything the painting on the left does not represent. It's not avant-garde, it's not urban, it's not driven by kind of the shock of the new. It's traditional. It shows sort of grandma and grandpa back at the farm. It takes its title from that sampler behind his head, The Lord is My Shepherd. It's exactly what everybody moves to New York to get away from. The painting represents, family, tradition, continuity, etc. So what makes Benton interesting is that he did this journey, that he was an avant-garde artist who decided not to stop being an avant-gardist. Here's a self-portrait of him. You could tell he was a rather pugnacious kind of guy. A nice self-portrait of him. And that he has decided to think of another way to be a modern artist, to look at America in a way that he hadn't been looking at it when he was painting that early painting by Bubbles. This is another painting by Benton from the late 20s, where he's traveling through the West. Now, here's what makes Benton interesting, and I think important for us as Midwesterners. He begins to argue that if you ask a New Yorker, every mile away from New York that you get stupider. Like if you're only 30 miles from New York, you're smarter than if you're 500 miles from New York. What Benton begins to argue is, well, wait a second. With every mile you get away from New York, you actually get closer to real America. You actually get closer to how men and women and families and people live really in the United States. And he begins to do that physically. Every summer, he taught in New York. He lived in New York. He was a professor at what we now call the New School. He would hop in the Model T and drive around the Adirondacks, eventually out here in the Ozarks and places like that, and look at America, look at sharecroppers and people working the earth and things like that. And he began to articulate that actually, distance from New York did not ensure your provinciality. Distance from New York ensured your access to real America. If you look at it in terms of population, even if you want to say that 10 million Americans live in New York and aren't quite 10 million, that means 290 million Americans don't live in New York. That's a lot of folks. And he's thinking a little bit about, well, wait a second, let's not argue that to be in the Midwest is to be provincial. Let's argue that to be in the Midwest is to be regional, that it's another part of the country with its own history, its own traditions, its own aesthetics. And he'll make this argument out loud and vociferously. Here's another painting by Benton, and there is, well, let me just go back here for a second so you can see there's Benton on the cover of Time magazine. This was a very famous argument that he articulated. I don't know who an artist would have to shoot today to get on the cover of Time magazine, but it would have to be somebody pretty important. Artists don't get on the cover of Time very, very often. But he's on the cover of Time because in the 1930s he was making this argument very intelligently and cogently. So what has happened to Thomas Hart Benton? He has been written out of the history of art. I'm going to guess that some of you who have taken 20th century art here have never heard of Thomas Hart Benton and didn't see his work. There's no Thomas Hart Benton paintings hanging at the Art Institute of Chicago. He's largely been expunged from the historical record because if you are a New Yorker and you're writing the history of modern art, you don't like this guy. This guy is challenging the narrative that you have set up as to what art should be about. Plus, I think if you're a New Yorker, you don't get the work. The work looks strange to you. It looks funny. It looks mediocre to you. Here's a nice later Benton of people in a very antique way. By the 1930s and 40s, they had threshers. There weren't too many people still threshing hay with big scythes like this. Now, some people were, but he's even going back to earlier technology. In fact, this painting, I think, is based on the Hay Wain by Bruegel, which hangs at the Metropolitan, if you know that painting. And when Benton finally had enough of living in New York and moved to Kansas City, it made the newspapers. This guy was a famous kind of guy. And he talks about why he's leaving. Mr. Benton will leave us flat, is sick of New York, and explains why. Place has gone insipid. He's going west to escape principles and talk. And he goes through the reasons why, after living in New York for 20 years, he's had enough, and he's going to move back to the Midwest where he was originally from. So this is a challenge to the main history that you're often taught. And I would argue not just a challenge, it's also a rethinking of what an artist might do to speak to the art of his or her region. Oops, I certainly don't want that yet. Here's a great painting by Benton called The Ballad of the Lover of Lone Green Valley. It's sort of a depiction of they didn't even call it country western then, of a hillbilly song. Here are the musicians, here's the song being acted out, and so here are the three musicians. Some of you may know this fact, that one of the great ironies of this story is that Benton was the teacher of one of the main heroes of the history of modern art, Jackson Pollock. There's the young Jackson Pollock when he was about 20 years old, who was then Benton's student. So there he is playing the kazoo there. And Pollock will grow up to be everything that Benton finds objectionable. Let me read you this quote by Benton. "A windmill, a junk heap, and a Rotarian have more meaning for me than Notre Dame or the Parthenon." Again, "A windmill, a junk heap, and a Rotarian have more meaning for me than Notre Dame or the Parthenon," by which, of course, he means that anything American, even a junk heap, is better than the Parthenon. That's his argument, that New York is too based on European culture, that New York is really just Europe's westernmost city, that the slavish adulation of Picasso and Matisse and European masters is bad. It prevents one from being an American artist. To be an American artist, you have to get out of New York and get into America. And that's literally what he does. I mean, he certainly walks the walk by leaving the cities and beginning to examine the rest of America. So I think a very, very important moment for us. He wasn't alone. Here he is with two other artists. There's Benton, of course. Here he is with Grant Wood of Iowa, who I'll show you. John Stewart Curry, who I won't show you today, but a wonderful artist from Wisconsin. But, here's Missouri, Iowa, Wisconsin. Why shouldn't there be great artists from Missouri, Iowa, and Wisconsin? Well, I think if you asked a New Yorker, they would say no. If an artist wants to be great, they should live in Paris or New York or Los Angeles. They should live in a great urban center where they're going to be challenged by other artists and et cetera. I think they would probably say, I don't know if you can be a great artist and live in Cedar Rapids, as Grant Wood did. That's going to be my argument. I mean, let me sort of make my conclusion now. I believe that you can live in San Antonio or Chicago or Seattle or Miami and make really important art about what it means to live at the beginning of the 21st century. I just don't think you can live in Chicago or San Antonio or Seattle or Miami and make important art about what it means to live in New York at the beginning of the 21st century. That's what a provincial does. A provincial is somebody who open-handedly apes the dominant style handed down by the art capital. And then the capital of art is New York. New York, I'm not here to argue that New York art is bad. New York is the largest art center in America. It has it's by far the most distinguished artists live and work in New York. But I would argue that if you live in New York, you see the world differently than if you live in Chicago or if you live in Kansas City. And that we have to think about Midwestern art not as watered down New York art, but as different, fundamentally different. And I hope to articulate that as we go on. Here, let me go through the Grant Wood comparison. Here's an early painting by Grant Wood, which I would argue is based on Impressionism. It's a painting done in Paris. Grant Wood went to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, went to Paris to, learn more about art. Presentations of Grant Wood like he was some kind of country bumpkin seem a little silly to me. He returns to America and does, let me do it this way. He returns to America and does paintings like the one on the right, which to me, again, I would argue everyone in this room understands that painting on the right. We know what it's like to live in a mid-sized town, in your case a southwest suburb where maybe the train runs through like it does here, and there's 2- and 3-story factories and little muck gardens, on the sidings, etc. But I would argue if you're from New York and you look at that painting on the right, you just don't get it. You don't understand why is he painting factories, 2- or 3-story factories in the middle of nowhere. But this is a painting that I think breathes the horizontality and the flatness of the Midwest. Here's the portrait of his mother, which I only bring in because it sets up, of course, his most famous painting. American Gothic, so I just thought we'd take a moment to look at that. Well, a painting which is really, really, really famous. It's an unbelievably well-known picture. You know, it's hanging at the Art Institute. A painting which to me is I find, well, I don't find it, actually I think this is why the painting is famous. The painting is famous because it's really so eerie and weird. Now, sometimes I think people don't look at it that hard, but to me this is a painting of barely suppressed marital violence. I mean, this is there's a guy holding a pitchfork. That's a symbol of the devil. The pitchfork is reproduced in his ruchrum of his, not ruchrum, the pattern of his overalls. He's looking straight at you, and he's holding that pitchfork so hard that his knuckles are turning white. You know, he's really got his hands around it, and he's going to protect what's his, and what's his is that woman who's, you know, looks over his shoulder, one little flick of blonde hair emerging. Notice that her apron is made of the same material that the curtains in the house are made of, a sort of sign of her domesticity. And he's going to look, you know, he's going to take care, he's going to protect what's his property, his woman, you know, his life. It's a stern, sober painting. And I think when we look at the painting, even the title, American Gothic, which sort of means American strangeness, I think it's kind of funny that we plop every subsequent president and first lady onto this picture. Although it did occur to me about a year and a half ago, they might have been able to reuse this photo. But that it's almost a rite of passage that we do this all the time for various reasons. But to me, it's a very, very strange and eerie painting. Now, here's what a New Yorker made of it. This is, I'm only showing you the picture part of this essay from 1946, where a guy broke America into three groups: the highbrow, the lowbrow, and the middlebrow. Notice what the highbrow guy is looking at, Picasso. The lowbrow guy is looking at like a pinup calendar, and the middlebrow guy is looking at American Gothic. And that is indeed the cliche of the Midwest, even to this day. If you think of sitcoms that take place in the Midwest, they're always kind of blue collar, you know, shot in a beer, kind of that sort of thing. Whereas sitcoms that take place in New York, everybody's so sophisticated, you know, or LA. That's because they're made in New York and LA. So they think of the Midwest as a kind of dumb place, not very sophisticated, not a fashion center, not a real hotbed of you know, the trendy. They look at the Midwest as like meat and potatoes and kind of slowed down. Now, I'm not arguing that that's completely untrue, but I would argue that's not necessarily how we see ourselves. I don't think we see ourselves as middlebrow, as this person does, because we admire the production of an artist such as Grant Wood. So, you know, it interests me. And these things, how the Midwest is treated in the national media, interests me. These are other wonderful paintings by Wood that celebrate the landscape of Iowa. Iowa is actually a great deal more hilly than Illinois is. Illinois is much more flatter. There's the birthplace of Herbert Hoover on your left, and Stone City, Iowa on the right, you know, almost bird's eye view, looking down on the landscape. So he's celebrating the very part of America that people on both coasts are telling him to ignore, because he feels its rhythms. I argue that place is a very, very important element in the construction of an artist's vision. Or I should say, it can be an important place. I would argue that place, like gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, is one of the factors that in variously determinable ways helps construct artistic vision. Again, I'm not arguing that place, everybody can only be, you know, you can only be a Chicago artist. That's not my argument, and there are many people here who don't fit the argument I'm making. But I would argue that place can influence. Place is context. Place is socialization. Place shows you the art world. You know, art making is not as personal as people think it is. I argue that art making is social, and you're always conscious of what we call the systems of reception wherein distinction is conferred. Even in your studios now, you're thinking about your professor or your colleagues or your crit that's coming up. You're thinking about those things. And if you were going to, you know, the Rhode Island School of Design, you'd be doing it differently because there'd be a different context there. And so place sculpts personhood in variously determinable ways, sometimes more, sometimes less, just as gender does, just as sexual orientation does. You know, it's among the, I'm old enough to remember when it said, well, it didn't matter if you were a man or a woman, it didn't matter if you were black and white, that art was some kind of universal language. I don't think we would say that any longer. I don't think we would make that argument anymore. I think it does matter if you're a man or a woman. I think so. So Wood interests me as a person who, and these are very funny paintings. I think there is Grant Wood, and I must confess, he does look like a guy who just got off the tractor and is painting a picture. He does look a little bit like a rube, I bet, although actually overalls are very good for painters, especially because they got a lot of pockets and keeps your arms loose. Overalls are good to paint in. De Kooning used to wear overalls to paint in. Here he is with a painting called Arbor Day, and so this painting to a New Yorker just looks corny and stupid and cliched. I think it's meant to be kind of funny and etc. Grant Wood wrote a book. That's one more book than a lot of other artists have written, where he talks about this, where he literally goes through the situation as he sees it, and says, quote, book is from 1935, painting has declared its independence from Europe and is retreating from the cities to the more American village and country life. So he's arguing that an artist should, quote, reveal the personality or section of his country. He did say his. That's what, you respond to your milieu. You are part of a community, whether you're aware of it or not. Now, I don't think it's necessarily true of extremely young artists. You're still learning your trade, etc. But if you become, let's say you stay here and become a member of the community, in various ways, the community will have impact on you. Who are the critics? Where are the galleries? How big are people wearing? A little thing, what you see will help form what you create. There's a late painting by Wood on the left that's in Terre Haute, if you're ever down there. And it carries to one of the great Chicago painters, Ivan Albright, very, very, very important artist. I'm really using these to make a couple points, so I guess let me just get on with it then. Ivan Albright, a great, great, great artist, I think. But New Yorkers hate this work, because this work to them is inexpressibly vulgar. When Ivan Albright had his retrospective at the Art Institute, it was well received, and then it went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art from here. And Hilton Kramer, who was then, still an important critic, then perhaps the most important critic. Let me read you the opening sentences of Hilton Kramer's review of the exhibition by the most famous Chicago artist. Now, this guy's from Chicago. Someday, quote, someday perhaps it may be explained to us why the curatorial authorities at the Metropolitan Museum of Art thought it appropriate to devote gallery space to this summer to a show called Ivan Albright Magic Realist. If you're not familiar with the name, don't worry. It is a name not worth remembering. The American artist Ivan Albright was a bizarre, minor, overrated talent in his day, which was pretty much over by the 1950s, and since then his work has been mercifully allowed to repose in the kind of unlamented obscurity in which posterity justly consigns pretentious mediocrity. I guess he didn't like it. Now, I'm going to argue that Hilton Kramer, it's not because he's a bad guy. Well, actually, Hilton Kramer is a bad guy, but that's another story. I should take it back. He says this about it because I argue he doesn't know how to look at this work. He doesn't understand the context, the tradition out of which this comes. He doesn't know, doesn't understand. So let me move on. So here are two paintings of the figure by Albright. That too, Hilton Kramer looked just gross, looked horrible, looked awful. To Hilton Kramer, the figure should look like this. This is what Hilton Kramer thinks the figure should be. The painting on the right, on the right, of course, is Michelangelo's David. The painting on the left is not the world's best reproduction. I'm sorry, the quality of the image is not very good. It shouldn't be quite that dark. Image by Ivan Albright. I want to make sure we get the title. And Man Created God in His Own Image. A painting by Ivan Albright. Now, Ivan Albright really believes that, every second takes you closer to death, that the body is filled with decay, that it's fascinating to look at. It's not that he thinks the body looks like this. He wants to sort of exaggerate the effects of age and the vicissitudes of life on the human figure. I would argue that actually men look more like the image on the left than they do like the one on the right, that Michelangelo's David with the very tiny waist, men don't have waists like that. That's a lie. Michelangelo is idealizing the figure here. Men don't have narrow waists. Men go straight through the middle there. And if men look like this at all, it's only at a particular time of their life. I would argue that the image on the right is more inaccurate than the image on the left is in terms of how men look or are going to look. But at any rate, I wouldn't just reject that thing on the left out of hand. It's rooted in a kind of almost obsessive, fastidious examination of the body and the body as a compendia of mania. We're going to see that again and again in some of the other artists that I'm going to show you. But Kramer just doesn't get it. Kramer just looks at it and says it's just bad. So, for example, there on the left is a painting by Albright. Well, actually, I guess I want it this way. Here is hanging in the Whitney Biennial now is the artist on the right, not the painting on the right. That's a painting by Jim Lutz called The Evening of My Dysfunction, where he sees himself as an inexpressively gross, huge hanging gut with, looks like non-working genitals standing over his girlfriend on Milwaukee Avenue in Chicago. To me, it's a painting very much in the tradition of the painting on the left. It's very much about the idea of the body as gross, our appetites as gross, funny maybe, so this is the tradition that I would argue New Yorkers are blind to. In this case, I wanted to show you a very early Albright on the left and a very late Albright on the right. The painting on the left was finished in 1926. The painting on the right was finished, 1977. So there's 51 years between these two paintings. But very stylistically, there isn't very much movement in them. And that's very typical of Midwestern art, is they sort of stay on target. So I want to sort of set this up now and do some of these comparisons or discussions of famous Midwestern artists of the last generation. I'm not going to talk too much about exactly contemporary things, although I think it applies to contemporary artists as well. That's an early painting by Ed Paschke. Remember Ed Paschke I showed you at the beginning of the lecture, the guy who died and got that obituary. That's an early painting by Paschke on the left called The Large Round Open from 1965, and that's a later Paschke on the right. I'm not going to always put the dates up, 1996. So the paintings are separated by 31 years, but notice what's similar about them. A passion for symmetry, high-keyed color, the human figure under stress. Albright, Lutz, Paschke, the human figure under stress, the human figure under stress, the human figure under stress. It's one of the leitmotifs of Midwestern art. Pattern, symmetry, high-keyed color, the figure. These are things that the Midwest has hung on to with great passion and fastidiousness. Here's a slightly different comparison. There's there's Andy Warhol's Marilyn Monroe on the left. There's Ed Paschke's Marilyn Monroe on the right. A tendency in Midwestern art to kind of befoul the altar of high culture. It's true that Hollywood and New York will decide what movies are made, but it's places like Chicago and Palos Heights that will decide if those movies are going to be successful or not. What Nixon used to say in the White House, let's see how it plays in Peoria. And Nixon was smart about a lot of that stuff. Because yes, there's one thing about Washington and New York and Los Angeles, but places like Peoria will really decide if it's going to go or not. The great Midwest, the common sense Midwest. So by putting Marilyn Monroe on top of an accordion player, he's besmirching the altar of that New York-Los Angeles access. Warhol, a New York artist, Marilyn Monroe, a Los Angeles figure, and they kind of are complicit in this canonization. Paschke's not so sure. He wants to, befoul the altar a little bit by putting her in this outfit. And if you're a New Yorker or from LA and you look at that, you don't like it. You like your myth. You like your Marilyn Monroe as, superstar, angel figure. Let me go through 4 images about the death of Kennedy, because I think they're kind of interesting. Kennedy was killed in 1963, about a year later. Rauschenberg made the image on your left. Great work of art by a great New York artist. Please, I'm not here to denigrate New York too much. Where he's thinking about Kennedy, so there's Kennedy. You see Kennedy, you see something about the space program, and you see other images that, that to him made him think of Kennedy. It's not a rebus, but made him think of Kennedy. On your right, a great painting by Andy Warhol, where he's thinking about the Kennedy assassination, but how is he thinking about it? He's thinking about the widow. Jackie Kennedy, taking pictures that had appeared in the newspaper of Jackie Kennedy in the day of and the day after the assassination, and taking them and putting them in this sort of arrangement of 16 images to make us think about the widow, to make us feel empathy as we would spend, some of you are too young, but some of you remember, we'll spend the rest of our lives or her lives following her life and who she married and how she died, stuff. She became a celebrity. Here's Paschke's vision of the Kennedy assassination. Not the victim, not the widow, but the perpetrator. The person whom I would argue where the most psychological energy resides. And then notice what he does. He takes Lee Harvey Oswald in this painting called Purple Ritual, but he surrounds him with all his patriotic bunting. It's as if it's like 4th of July parade and war, so it doesn't make sense in a certain sense. It's a problematic image, it's a testing image, it's a challenging image, and I would argue it's a great image. And I think all these images, all three of these are great paintings. I'm not here to argue that the New York paintings are not great paintings, they are. But this is also a great painting. But it's a painting that takes this askew glance at mainstream culture. It just comes at it slightly differently. And I'll show you one more by Roger Brown called Assassination Crucifix, which is actually a kind of a cartoony image of the Kennedy assassination taking place. You actually see Kennedy's head exploding there in the center. So those things interest me. These two Chicago images, as compared to the New York ones, intrigue me. So there'll be a few more of these kinds of comparisons because I think they're interesting. Yeah, there's the female body. There's the sort of canonical realist female body presenting the woman as bare of sexual attributes by a artist on the right. There's Paschke's image on the left, which, although I think does still celebrate women's bodies, also turns it strange a little bit by this, and this is an early painting from the 70s, 1973, called Wanda, by this sense of tattooing all over the body, exaggerating, doesn't look that exaggerated to me, but exaggerating the hairline a little bit. But you get my drift. By making it strange, elongating it, that's very, very typical of what Chicago artists do. And New Yorkers, I don't think it's not that so much that they don't like it, they just don't get it. They don't understand the language that he's speaking. This is connected to those Ivan Albrights. Do you see what I'm talking about? That there's a tradition here that these generations of artists pick up on. There's a Carl Wearsome painting on the left, Screaming Jay Hawkins, a great Chicago artist. Carl Wearsome has a show just opened at Gene Albano Gallery if you're going to River North. And I bring it in and I show it next to a piece of Native American Tlingit art from the Pacific Northwest, a bear screen. Because Wearsome is not looking at European art for his inspiration. He is looking at self-taught art, Mexican art, Native American art. So it's not based on Michelangelo, it's based on a whole other worldview of the idea of the figure as pattern. And it's also based on psychedelia and other kinds of things that he's thinking about it in the late 1960s. But he's just looking at a different tradition. And therefore you can't judge it by the tradition you were judging the other things by. There's Titian on your right and Carl Wearsome again on your left. He's not interested in he's interested in the figure as pattern, not in the women as classical kinds of nudes and things like that. That doesn't intrigue him at all. And he just has a different agenda, so you have to judge it by different agenda. It doesn't make any sense to go for Thai food and say, hey, this food doesn't taste anything like Mexican food. Well, that's not doesn't make sense. That's not and I would argue it doesn't make any sense to look at Chicago art and say, well, it doesn't look like, and judge it by the criteria that you're judging New York art by. It's a separate kind of zone, I would argue, to some degree. A couple more of these comparisons. There again, that's a Carl Wearsome on the left. There's a Tibetan mandala image on the right. Now, of course, I'm not arguing that they're the same, but the transformative vision that drives the image on the right, I would argue drives Wearsome. Flatness, figure as pattern, two-dimensional, all those things again and again and again. And this sets up a tradition, and Carl Wearsome still teaches at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. So he passes it on to the next generation of students, etc. This is Jim Nutt, who will have a retrospective at the MCA next year. Jim Nutt on your left, and there's a Persian, actually it's a Mughal, right? Let me see, oops, I forgot now. I think an Indian, yeah, it's an Indian manuscript illumination. In terms of the pattern and the what's called horror vacui, filling in the composition everywhere. I think quite typical of the thing that Jim Nutt is looking at. for inspiration, not at Western tradition, not at Renaissance art. He's not looking at Rembrandt, he's not looking at Rubens. He's looking at odds and ends of other kinds of cultural material. There's Barbara Rossi, a wonderful, I think a terrific artist, and I can't tell you how beautiful the paintings like the one on the left are. They're painted in little dots on the back of a plane of plexiglass. So in other words, the surface of the painting isn't even the surface of a painting, it's the surface of the plexiglass. You know, she's painting on the back of the plexiglass like she's a sign painter, like a window painter, with little tiny dots. You know, sometimes, let me see if I can get in close. Well, I can't get in super close, but these are each tiny, tiny dots, and there are thousands and thousands of them in this composition. And I compare it to from the Book of Kells, you know, great medieval manuscript painting of the Book of Kells, in terms of this fastidiousness and craftspersonship, which I would argue is one of the great qualities of Midwestern art, a kind of hunker down, concentration, small scale. The painting is small, the page is small. Midwestern art is often small in scale, as opposed to New York art, which is large in scale, and that's fine, it's just a different tradition. And these traditions, I don't think, are fully understood. You know, sometimes I argue that place can be influenced by historical accidents. Like, look at these two paintings. The painting on the left, as you know, is at the Art Institute. The painting on the right is at the Museum of Modern Art. There are times when I look at things like this. Here's a painting by Rei Yoshida, wonderful, wonderful artist, where I would argue that the painting on the right is influenced by the fact that he was a professor at the School of the Art Institute, but just like you, looks at the Seurat from time to time, and his painting is influenced by having the Seurat around him. You know, I think you could do a whole show of Chicago artists who are influenced by having this great, 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 great painting. And I think, let me now figure out, I gotta go back here. All right, and then I go ahead here. And here's Bill de Koenig's Woman of 1950. I would argue that Bill de Koenig's Woman is somewhat, again, I'm not arguing it's a direct copy, but somewhat influenced by the fact that if you live in New York, you look at Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon at the Museum of Modern Art. If you're an artist, you look at it often. And this idea of the, you know, aggressiveness at the figure. Here you can see the difference between New York and Chicago here. Chicago, I often argue, is the painters in Chicago work with the second knuckle, I argue. They work with the second knuckle. About that knuckle. That's it. They hold the brush and they paint like that. The painting on your left is done at least with the wrist. Could even be done with the elbow. You know, it's not this. You can't make that painting on the left with the second knuckle. It can't be done. You gotta really let it rip. You gotta use your arm. And so I would argue that represents and I don't think necessarily it's a historical accident that those two paintings are where they are. But when you look at these two next to each other, the Chicago on the right, the New York on the left, they're just independent of one another. That's my main argument, that Chicago and the Midwest are an independent art center within the larger context of what is American art. Just as if I was teaching you a class in Renaissance Italian art, we would be talking about Florentine art as different than Venetian art. They're both Italian, but nobody would argue that Titian and Michelangelo look alike. They look different because one comes from Venice and follows the traditions of Venetian art. One comes from Florence and follows the traditions of Florentine art. It's not to minimize their own greatness, but they are trained in a language, and the language is inculcated within a place, and the place has local traditions. That's the argument. How am I doing? I'm chopping. I don't know if the chips are flying, but I'm chopping. And some of these things are just things that I find curious. You know, here on your left is, of course, The Old Guitarist by Picasso hanging at the Art Institute. On the right is a painting by Paschke. Now, I don't know. I wish I had asked Paschke. I knew him very, very well, but I never asked him, is this painting on the right called Guitaio? Is it based on The Old Guitarist by Picasso? He went to the School of the Art Institute, undergraduate and graduate degree. So he looked at that painting on the left hundreds and hundreds of times. And did it come to him? Did he think of it? Is this an homage? Is it meant to be? Even the color is the same. I don't know. But the presence of the painting, I think, is not without significance. We'll just move on from there. I think I can skip this one. I was going to compare Westerman to Giacometti, but I'm going to move on from that one. That's I always like this one, though. That's a Duchamp on the left, typical of conceptual art, called In Advance of a Broken Arm. It really is just a snow shovel. I shouldn't say that. It's a great work of art. I mean, I admire Duchamp very, very much. But it's a snow shovel. He didn't do anything to it. He didn't alter it, except by putting it up on a gallery wall and declaring for it the status of an art object. That's ready-made. I'm sure you've studied some of these things. And that's an interesting thing to do, because it's art when it hangs on a wall in a museum or a gallery, then it's art. If it hangs on a nail in your garage, it's a snow shovel. But that's the difference. But on the right is a wonderful sculpture by Margaret Wharton showing also, I assume, pick handles or shovel handles, which become beautiful ballet dancing feet of somebody. So very, very rich image, I would argue. I wanted to talk a little bit about Hollis Sigler, because again, she interests me as somebody who also turned away from her skills. The painting on the right, she just finished having, of course she's no longer with us, she passed away in 2001. The painting on the right was done right when she got out of grad school at the School of the Art Institute. It's a very sophisticated photorealist painting of people's legs in a swimming pool. Very hard to paint that, because you have to paint all this water reflections, the idea of legs that don't really have weight, because they're, chopping through the water. It's a very, very difficult, challenging thing to paint. And then she too will give all that up and start making drawings like the one on the right, originally in crayon, very childlike, direct, visceral images that are about feminism for her. I think, these were all of the creature comforts of the house are piled up in the center of the house and set on fire, and the walls are buckling with blood. Really, really fascinating image. And because she found this to be a way of speaking about her concerns and feelings. I think she's really a remarkable artist. The one on the right, painted on one of those little pieces of pine panel from like a bad lodge in Wisconsin, you can almost smell the pine. And it says, "If you are right, I must be wrong." It's one of my favorite paintings of a human relationship. You have the one chair sitting up very erect and very sure of itself, and the other chair cut and bleeding and rent asunder. And it's obviously a painting of a relationship, a moment within a relationship. The painting on the left, just celebrating the mundane, celebrating, a summer night at the Dairy Queen. You can almost hear the bug zapper, when you were young and you would go there and get a dipped cone, or when you're a teenager and you would hang out there. I mean, it accepts, they're almost like modern genre paintings to me. They just accepts what it is to be a middle-class American. I think she was a great, great, great artist. Among my many bad books is a bad book on Hollis Sigler. The World is Endless. I always get the titles mixed up. The World is Endless Desire on the right. Again, notice how there's never humans present in her work, but they're very rich in human presence. Again, you see 4 people have had dinner together and are not there, but you could still feel the joy of 2 couples, let's say, together, and friendship and stuff. The one on the left, of course, the book that I wrote about her was about her struggles with breast cancer that eventually she succumbed to. And so that's her idea of a world gone mad, when dogs run wild in a house and rip the house apart. And that's her metaphor for her disease and running around the walls, running around the image, or things that speak to that. She always had really was a remarkable person. And because even when she had the cancer, the painting on the left was done during the cancer time, because there were moments of great exhilaration. This one's called "It Is Good There Is Desire." The one on the right is really her situation, to know that you're dying, and here the house is destroyed, the trees are rent, but somebody has planted a tree there in the foreground. A way of thinking about the future that will exist beyond each of our time here. So we're getting near the end. Yeah, there's just another Jim Lutz painting I wanted to bring on the right. Here's an image that's over at Governor State, which I know is not too far from here, right? Governor State isn't too far, right? And I've not been there since it's been there, but I really, really want to go over there and see it. I don't think I'll make it there today. It's a sculpture by a young, well, I shouldn't say young, he's about getting close to 50 now, I guess. Seems young to me. Sculptor named Tony Tassett, who did this piece called Paul, 2006, and as you can see, I'm sure I'm not wrong, right? It's at University Park at Governor State University. It's like Paul Bunyan, the great Midwestern figure, but he's exhausted, he's tired, he's out of steam. Like the great Midwestern myth is sort of fulfilled and maybe done. Here, his axe is too heavy for him to hold. It's almost slipping out of his fingers. So I'm very much looking forward to going and seeing it. I assume that's a person over here, so you can tell it's a big sculpture as it stands there. I'll end with a sort of one of the things I should say at the beginning, which is there's no such thing as a Midwestern artist or a Chicago artist. They're just men and women who live in Chicago or men and women who live in the Midwest that are artists. I still argue that there's certain uber themes, certain overarching traditions that have been and to some degree continue to be part of the culture here. And that has happened independently of art produced elsewhere and should be seen within that context. The larger reason why I like to give this lecture at a place like this is for the young artists here, for the students here, to in some degree learn to take pride in their place. That sometimes our worst enemy, I think, is our own inferiority complex some of us have. That, well, I live in Chicago. Of course, you live in Chicago. I can't see why you would feel inferior. But if you feel, well, I'm not living in the cosmopolitan capital of my culture, that's New York, and I'm not living in the trendy laboratory of tomorrow, that would be LA. I'm living in Chicago. It's kind of it's not quite as hip. But I would argue that there is a long, long tradition of great visual art that you are part of, that you are a legacy of, that you're being taught by men and women who themselves have come out of that tradition, and that not only is the Midwest, I think, the greatest kept secret in contemporary art, and I really do believe that, but it is one of the great, great, great centers of contemporary art. Thank you. Now, I'm happy to take a couple of questions or some comments or something like that, if anybody has anything they want to run by me. You mean it was perfect?
Just a question. Let's see about this one. Well, in terms of success, we talked about success and a dynamic, a regional understanding of, I guess, of style, but also influence and history and lineage, and talked about that. I was talking to a friend in New York, and we were talking about Chicago artists, and he used to live here, so I think he has this kind of like post-Midwestern snobbery that I find kind of.
What did he say?
He has kind of a post-Midwestern snobbery.
Right.
Like now that he's moved out,
right.
He loves the kind of, back talk Midwest, which is, it's in good fun. But and we were talking to a particular artist, and he said, "Oh, this is so Chicago, right? The mediocrity that rises of someone who seems to have an international presence, but really has no international side. So they have this show in some small town in France, or they have this, and they've escalated their way up into a major position at a local university or something. But thinking about it maybe in a less jaded way about the idea of success and how that might play out in a place where you're part of the international conversation, say in New York, versus being in Chicago, like
right.
where the question of success becomes. Is there a different understanding of success when you're in the margins, or not?
Well, first of all, I must say that I agree with you. I would argue that a Midwestern artist who is let's say a terrific practitioner of what I've been describing will have a less successful career than a similarly placed person in New York, maybe even a person less well placed in New York. That yes, in terms of the megaphone of contemporary art, Chicago has little or none. So yeah, it's like being a really, really great actor in Chicago. No good, You've got to get to New York or LA to have that go to the next level. So yes, I would tend to agree that if international success and allure is what you seek, it's much harder to get done from here than from New York or LA or Berlin or London or Paris or someplace like that, although some of them vary a great deal. A lot of it depends on how you I think in the long term that will change, or it will change in a retrospective manner. In other words, if you lived in the 17th century, nobody ever heard of Rembrandt, Vermeer, Hals, Ruysdael. Nobody ever paid any attention to any of the Dutch painters of the 17th century. Now we look back at them as some of the greatest artists of their time. In the 17th century, they would have talked about Bernini and Velázquez and Sir Christopher Wren because they were famous artists. Rubens. Nobody ever heard of Rembrandt. Now that Rembrandt died a poor man, so I don't know how great it is for him that now he's considered to be famous. But I would talk about what are some of the compensations for a career spent in Chicago. One of the curious things about Chicago is that Chicago, more than any other art center in the history of human civilization, has a higher percentage of teacher artists. Of all these artists I just showed you, he's a professor, Tony Tassett. He's a professor, Jim Lutz. Ed Paschke was a professor. Barbara Rossi was a professor. Carl Wilson was a professor. I'm just trying to think of who I just showed you in the last hour. Almost every one of them are professors. That's not true in New York. In New York, if you're a professor, it means you're a bad artist. It's not true in LA. But in Chicago, the amount of teaching artists is enormous. It's mind-boggling. Almost every major artist in the history of Chicago art has been a professor. Roger Brown was not a professor. So there are some that didn't go that route. Now, part of what that means is I think the Chicago tradition gets passed on to the next generation because so many of the artists here are teachers. Gene Dunning is an artist. Judy Ledgerwood's an artist. Galen Gerber's an artist. They're all artists. Or they're all teachers, rather. That's quite fascinating to me. So a lot depends on lifestyle choices. Some people choose to have a life here in the Midwest and do things that they couldn't do if they lived in New York. So sometimes it's a choice to stay in one place. I know for Paschke it was a choice to stay here. He could have moved to New York if he wanted to, but he didn't want to. But people who live in New York think that you should have made that choice. And if you haven't made that choice, you're somehow chicken or you're somehow provincial. See, to me, when you hear the word provincial, I say the word provincial, many of you think it's the same meaning as the word regional. That regionalism means provincialism, and that's where I think people go wrong. Regionalism does not mean provincialism. Regionalism means your region. Now, our region is smaller and less powerful than New York is, but it's not without some significance. Yes?
Did you say that the internet has at least shrunk the gap?
Yeah, that's always a great question about that. Has the internet choice? I would argue little. I would argue no, but I would probably be smarter to argue little. That's an old argument. There were times 100 years ago, people said, well, now that we have radio, place doesn't matter anymore. And then it was, well, now we have television, place doesn't matter anymore. The internet, I think, allows provincialism because now you can sit in your room and look at the galleries in New York and say, well, I can do that. I can watch. And I would argue that makes people provincial. I don't think it's had that big a change, a fundamental, causal, huge change. I think the tradition here, who your teachers are, the weather, the landscape here, all these things impact you more than something like the internet does. But it's a fair thing to say that perhaps we will become bored. Many people think we now do live in a sort of world without borders or a one world, that sort of stuff. I still believe in the Balkans as a model for contemporaneity, where I think people here are better looking than the people in Evergreen Park. I think any movement at all changes you, I think. But it is fair to say, are these things blurring a little bit because of something that seems so transcendently borderless as the internet? So I would probably guess no, but I can't speak for everyone. Other thoughts or comments or questions or observations? Great. Well, again, let me thank you again so much. It really was a pleasure coming down here and meeting you and looking at a lot of your work, and I'll look forward to coming back in another 20 years.